I would now like to introduce today's presenters. Achint Arora is a partner and a member of the pricing assurance team and assists clients on topics related to price, solution, and contract benchmarking. Rahul Gikhani is a partner at Everest Group and a member of the pricing assurance team. He assists clients on topics related to price and contract benchmarking, strategic engagement reviews, and sourcing cost rationalization. Udit Maheshwari is a practice director on the pricing assurance team and assists clients on topics related to price benchmarking, solution review, and contract evaluation for software. Shikarajit Mitra is a practice director on the pricing assurance team, where he assists clients on strategic, commercial, and contractual topics, including sourcing strategy, vendor solution evaluation, service provider rate card benchmarking, strategic engagement review, and software license optimization. And with that, I would like to turn things over to Rahul. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to welcome all participants to today's webinar on how enterprises can keep a check on their spend on software and cloud spends. Before we give an overview of the topics that we will cover, it will be worth touching upon why we felt that this topic should be relevant to enterprises, and why we should spend the next 60 minutes of our valuable time on it. So the answer is simple. Given the economic uncertainty, enterprises across the globe are closely looking at their IT spend and how to manage it best. Mostly, we see enterprises trying to achieve that by maximizing the savings from outsourcing services. We believe it makes sense to broaden the horizon a bit and also focus on contracts that they have for software products and cloud platforms. This is because outsourcing services typically account for only about 25 to 35% of the IT spend, while software and hardware accounts for more, for about 30 to 40%. In spite of the smaller size, outsourced services are the first choice for scrutiny or for negotiations, because they are generally more, they have more transparent contracts, and in contrast, software or hardware or cloud contracts end up having a black box nature or a convoluted pricing mechanism, which is difficult for enterprises to understand and then negotiate on. We believe that the insights that we will share in this webinar will help enterprises develop an initial sense of how they should look at optimizing their spend on software and cloud. And with that as the background, let's move to the next slide to glance through the discussion topics. So we have 4 main discussion points today. Firstly, we will speak a bit about the key challenges in negotiating software and cloud contracts. Next, we will examine the most keenly negotiated clauses in software and cloud deals. Subsequently, we will discuss the best practices to keep software and cloud spend in check. And lastly, we will look at how software pricing is expected to trend this year. We will also aim to cover some questions from the audience at the end of the discussion. So feel free to share any questions that you might have via the chat. And with that, let's begin with the first topic. Now, I'll hand it over to Achint. Achint, you have been looking at a lot of SaaS and cloud contracts for the past 6 months. What do you believe are the challenges faced by enterprises in negotiating them?
Sure, Rahul, thank you very much. So if you look at the, the number of types itself, there's a large variety within that, right? And we do see often enterprises getting confused. What's the value of one versus the other? So on the left-hand side, if you talk about the contracting regimes, term-based licenses have been there for a long time and the most preferred model often in situation, right? Now, these are like fixed term licenses, 3-year, 5-year, many of the on-premise solutions are structured around that, right? If we talk about the perpetual licenses, that is where we have, let's say, a perpetual license fee and an annual maintenance that needs to be paid. Again, perpetual licenses in its own uniqueness are going down, right, and are being taken over by the consumption-based licenses, which are truly on the basis of how much do you consume, right? So that's on the contracting regime part. If you go on the licensing metric, which is ultimately linked to the contracting regime, we do see that, the licensing part, some of the software vendors charge on the basis of the user-based metrics, right? So number of users, it can be floating, name, dedicated, all of those confusions, all of those availabilities that are there in the market. And there's no consistent theme or consistent approach that is being followed by one versus the other. Even in cases where they are offering pretty much similar functionalities, right? If we talk about the infrastructure services metric, it's all about, the processors, node, shot, especially on the cloud side. And lastly, business driven metric. Let's say, for example, Guidewire as a platform, it charges you on the basis of the direct written premium, a percentage of that. Now, within that, is it the total volume of the DWPs that are processed by that firm, or is it the DWPs that pass through that Guidewire platform, right? So it's a lot of confusion around what I should be paying as a firm. So net, a lot of challenges, a lot of confusion that we see often enterprises grappling with, right? If we talk about this, let's talk about the next slide, which focuses on the poll, right? Now we have, for our audience today, we have shared a few options. Now these are one or more. You can select one or more options. So based on your knowledge of the market, what are some of the challenges that you face? Let's take some time to capture the results. All right. Do we have the results? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Perfect. So, Udit, what do you think based on whatever you are seeing today being reported by our readers, listeners?
Right. So, Achint, as the polls indicate, inflation in cost is the topmost challenge that most of the audience is facing today while they negotiate their SaaS or cloud contracts. And then it is followed equally by complex licensing metrics and underutilization of purchase licenses. And this is pretty much what we expected. So, if we can move to the next slide, we'll talk about some of these challenges and some others that we see our clients face when they negotiate with their software providers. So I'll talk about these in some details. The first one being added features and functionalities coupled with ambiguity. So what it essentially means is that software providers today, in order to stay competitive, they're upgrading their products every now and then with new features and functionalities. Now, not all of these features would be useful for each of the organization, right? But software providers would expect a fair price in return for these added enhancements. This is also coupled with ambiguity in pricing in the sense that not most of the software providers publish their list prices on their website, right? So for buyers, it becomes very difficult to ascertain what should be the starting price at which they should start negotiating. The second challenge that we're seeing, especially in 2023, is around high wage inflation. As we all know that the global economy is facing strong headwinds, the inflation is at an all-time high. Now, in order to stay profitable, software providers have already started increasing their prices, either in proportion to or in many cases, even higher than the prevalent CPI. Buyers, on the other hand, would always expect a price reduction when they're negotiating, right? So these two polar stances taken by buyers and software providers add to the overall complexity. Now, it's often very time consuming, difficult, and expensive for an organization to switch from an existing software platform to a new one. And software providers know how sticky their product is for a particular customer, and then they leverage this information to charge premium at the time of renewal, which is our third challenge. The fourth and fifth are closely linked, which says that the software prices are not standard, and so are the discounts. These discounts are also not standard. The discounts that a particular enterprise would get depends largely upon the enterprise's industry, the geography, the contract term, and the strategic importance of the enterprise for that particular software provider. Not only are these prices not standard, the pricing mechanism, like Achintya spoke about, right? They're also not standard. So there are some software providers who would charge based on number of cores or number of processors, while there are some other software providers who would charge based upon the number of users or a percentage of revenue or impact created. Last but not the least, we often see in client situations that there is lack of information sharing and collaboration between IT, user function, and procurement function. Now, unless the procurement function is armed with information regarding what has been the past consumption of the licenses and what is the future demand estimates, they are unable to formulate a very strong negotiation strategy. So these are some of the challenges that we've seen our clients face while negotiating with their software providers. Shikhar, what are some of the similar challenges that you would have seen in cloud contracts?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question, Udit. So while a lot of the points that you mentioned apply here as well, right? But I wanted to talk about some of the particular points, some of the specific points when it comes to the hyperscalers. The first point to note is uncertain demand. And what we mean by that is, so for example, the demand for cloud services can shoot up in a very short span of time. And on the other hand, the demand may slack due to suboptimal migration to cloud or less adoption, slower business growth, etc. And that's one of the first challenges that enterprises face, right? The second point to note is the point on upfront commitment. And I think we are all fairly aware of the fact that hyperscalers offer volume discounts. So for example, the enterprise volume discount by Azure, enterprise discount program by AWS, to enterprise customers against the minimum upfront annual commitment. Now, but the quantum of volume discount increases with an increase in the upfront commitment. The challenge lies in identifying the right balance between the commitment and the discount. So that's the second point that we see often. The third point is the fact that the discount plans itself are not necessarily always fairly straightforward and simple. It's a complex discount plan. And public cloud providers offer significant discounts via, let's say, the programmatic discount plans around reserved instances, spot instances, savings plans, etc. So these plans reduce the cost of cloud services significantly, at times maybe even, let's say, by 80%, 90% in some cases. They're difficult to understand. And the other point to note here is these programmatic discounts are not applicable on all services, and that's a challenge to navigate, right? The third point, and this is a fairly important, the fourth point, which is a fairly important point, is the single versus multi-vendor cloud kind of story, right? So most enterprises find it challenging to decide their vendor strategy when selecting hyperscalers. A single vendor strategy will probably lead to higher volume discounts and a better commercial agreement. It obviously leads to a vendor lock-in. A multi-vendor strategy can ensure flexibility and probably reduce the risk of vendor lock-in, but there are certain challenges that exist there as well, right? So that's the fourth point. The last point, and this is again, which we've come across multiple times, is the point or the aspect around the legacy enterprise licenses. So, for example, what we mean by that is Microsoft Azure, for example, offers hybrid benefits to its customers who have procured server licenses under an enterprise agreement. Now, this benefit allows customers to keep the existing licenses for on-premise and cloud workloads over an extended period of time. Figuring out if your inventory, has, and whether you have such licenses in place is also an important step. So those are the top 5 pointers. There are many others as well, but those are the top 5 pointers that we wanted to discuss. And now I'll hand it over to Rahul to move to the next slide.
Yes, thanks, Shikhar. So one thing is clear, it is certainly not easy to negotiate a competitive SaaS or cloud contract. And if people in our audience are wondering whether there is further value to be unlocked in their own contracts, please do sign up for a complimentary diagnostic study with us by clicking on the link that will come up on the chat window. We will be happy to look at your contract, compare it with other similar contracts in the industry, and assess the high-level opportunity. Your contract can be for any of the following products: Microsoft Productivity Suite, SAP, Oracle, Salesforce, Azure, AWS. All right. With that, let's move to the next section. And we'll talk about the clauses that are most keenly negotiated in SaaS and cloud contracts. Shikhar, you have supported a number of enterprises in optimizing their SaaS contracts. So which clauses prove to be the most keenly negotiated ones?
Yeah. So, again, I think that's a very pertinent question. And so based on our experience working with enterprises and helping them on their SaaS licensing journey, we've observed a trend on how negotiations play out. Fundamentally, there are two categories of clauses or terms and conditions that get negotiated. The first category of clauses are the ones that have a direct impact on the cost of ownership, right? These are the commercial clauses, which is what we see on the slide here. And we have called out the four most common clauses that we see all the time. And when you look at the clauses in this category, the first and foremost clause, no surprise, is the actual fees that is being charged. And while the core fees remains the most hotly debated topic in most commercial negotiations, in our observation, enterprises also negotiate additional aspects such as that, that have a material implication on the overall fees, such as service credits, fees for ongoing support, non-production environment inclusions, exclusions, and how they get provisioned, how they get used, etc., etc. Second in this category is how volume discounts are structured. Volume discounts clearly play an important role for enterprises, and that's why they get negotiated hotly. They play an important role in the sense that as they scale their usage, it incentivizes them for larger purchases, potentially increasing the adoption rates and helping them reduce their per unit cost. Negotiating better discounts typically leads to an increase on the return on investment for enterprises, and that is why it's probably the second most important, most common clause that we see. Very important clause that we see fairly frequently is the price hike or the price protection clause, right? And while price hikes are necessary evil that all enterprises must deal with, an approach that aligns with the contracting situation, right? So both macroeconomic as well as the pricing competitiveness of the offer will allow both parties to arrive at a mutually acceptable outcome sooner. That's what we've seen. The next point, the fourth point, is around pricing tiers. Now, tiers are built into most SaaS pricing structures, and it's a way for platform providers to charge more for higher usage. And we've typically seen a very careful evaluation is done, and unless that is done relative to specific enterprise needs around scalability, we've seen it leave the enterprise with an unexpected bill in the end, right? And those are the four most common clauses. I think, do you want to touch upon some of the other types of clauses, the operational clauses?
Sure, Shikhar, thanks. Right. So in the previous slide, we talked about the commercial implications or the commercial areas where those negotiations happen, right? On this slide, we talk about the operational or the non-commercial aspects, right? First one is the limitations of liability. Now, as a standard, what we see is that for any of the contract, there are two parts. There's the primary liability, there's the secondary liability that are created in the software product contract, right? Now, the typical market benchmark, if you can say, is like, the 12 months of the last 12 months payment term is what you link the termination for cause, right? That's what it is. But we do see that there are often secondary caps that are introduced, which may be linked to security. Again, we'll be covering security as a third parameter here as well. But there are different nuances that can be incorporated into the limitations, right, which can be favoring the enterprise. Now, on the termination, sometimes what happens is that the enterprise, provide mechanism for ending the agreement. They are provided the mechanism, and they have a different need. They have a different direction towards which they want to move. So they often even negotiate on the termination clauses really hard, right? Then if we talk about the data security, the fact that the data security protocols, the policies keep on changing country to country, right? So that also kind of makes the whole process really complex, right? For example, as recent as yesterday, I came to know that Italy has banned ChatGPT, right? So that's new kind of development that keep on happening within the software space, and that keeps the product vendors on the tenterhooks and the enterprise also on tenterhooks to negotiate these clauses. Lastly, the enterprises usually negotiate on the performance level. Now, there are variations within that we see that certain set of product vendors stick to their own certain standard SLAs and they don't really negotiate. Having said that, there are also software vendors who negotiate on the performance level and have a different pricing depending on the performance level they are giving. Please bear in mind that often the product vendors are themselves hosting on public cloud, so they are dependent on ultimately the AWS, Azure, and the GCPs of the world, right? So often their SLAs are bound to how those cloud vendors are performing themselves, right? So all of these are the other operational clauses or non-commercial clauses that typically, the enterprise end up negotiating for, right? And then in the next slide, there are some additional clauses that find way to the negotiation table. So Udit, you want to take that up?
Sure, Achint. So, Achint and Shikhar, you spoke about the clauses for SaaS contracts. While I focus on this page, we have some of the keenly negotiated clauses in cloud contracts. So the first thing that catches our eyes is the unilateral changes. This is essentially, when we see contracts from hyperscalers, there is this language that allows hyperscalers to make unilateral changes, and these changes also include discontinuation of certain resource units or services. Now, enterprises might not have a lot of leeway in negotiating this completely, but what enterprises can do is negotiate a longer notice period for termination of certain services, especially if those cloud services are being used to support business critical applications. The second thing that we notice enterprises keenly negotiate is around utilization credits. Now, as Shikhar already mentioned, right? So it's very, very difficult for any enterprise to correctly predict what would be their overall cloud consumption in the next 6 to 12 months, right? Often we see enterprises in a situation wherein they would have committed for say X billion dollars, but they've used only a portion of it and the remaining is up for discussion, right? And now with an increasing pressure on cost optimization, etc., enterprises are negotiating with hyperscalers to get credits for their unutilized budget and then move it to the next contract renewal and use it there. So that is the second one. The third one is around minimum commitment, and this is primarily the most important clause in any hyperscaler contract, because it is the minimum commitment that a customer is willing to make to a hyperscaler, and based on the minimum commitment, the customer receives an overall account level discounts, committed savings, etc. Right? Just for everybody's reference, Azure, for instance, gives out volume level discounts from 1 to 20%. So that range itself is very high. So it's very, very essential to understand what would be the optimum level of minimum commitment that would get enterprises the right level of volume discounts without getting into a situation wherein the enterprise commit a lot and then don't end up using it. Very strongly linked to minimum commitment is service credits. Now, obviously, the enterprises always expect better and better discounts. Hyperscalers, instead of giving just more discounts after a certain point of time, what they offer enterprises is service credits. And now these service credits can be used by enterprises for certain downstream value adds like training, certifications, data migrations, etc. So net, these are the four most keenly negotiated clauses that we have seen in our experience. Over to you, Rahul, for the next section.
Thanks, Udit, for sharing these insights. So one thing is for sure, in the current economic situation, these clauses will become even more important, and the intensity of negotiations is bound to increase, in the coming months. If that is the case, enterprise IT and procurement teams will have to really up their game to keep spend in check. So let's look at the SaaS contracts first. Udit, again, back to you. What do you think is a good starting point for enterprises to manage spend on SaaS contracts?
Sure, Rahul. And SaaS spend optimization has become kind of one of the buzzwords in every enterprise, irrespective of their size. Often you will find IT and procurement teams deliberating and discussing ways of how they can optimize spend without impacting business deliverables. So what we see on this page are the levers that enterprises can start using immediately, even without contacting their software providers, to optimize their overall demand and hence optimize spend on software, right? So going from left to right, the first three levers from left are the basis of Everest Group's 3R framework as well. This framework has been used by our clients to optimize their SaaS spend. And it essentially talks about reducing waste, which essentially means use all that you paid for. Identify software licenses or subscriptions that haven't been used by the users over a prolonged period of time, say at least a quarter, and then I explore the option of surrendering them if they are no longer required. Identify applications that have overlapping functionalities, and if there are certain applications that have very few users, we would want to sunset those applications and save cost in them. The third is right sizing the requirement, which essentially means that the enterprises should conduct persona profiling within their workforce to identify 2 or 3 different kind of users in the workforce, and then map those user groups with the different versions or editions of a particular software product. This will help enterprises form an optimized bill of material and save on cost. Moving towards the towards the center is the consolidate requirement. This is nothing but creating a centralized view of the requirement. Instead of buying licenses for each BU separately, the organization should strive to negotiate a central contract so that the numbers are large, and hence buyers can negotiate a better per unit rate because of economies of scale. Next, what enterprises can also do is explore the option of moving support for some non-critical business applications to a third-party vendor. Now, some of the third-party vendors could be Rimini, Street, or Spinnaker, and we've seen that moving the support to these can help enterprises save a lot of cost. Also, it's not essential for all the software products to have SLAs which are platinum tier or the best in class. For non-business critical applications, enterprises can also explore the option of moving the SLAs to a gold tier or a silver tier, and obviously that would come with a reduction in the prices. Last but not the least, enterprises should keep a check on how and who is doing the procurement, because nowadays we see that individual functions, be it marketing, be it sales, they end up purchasing a lot of SaaS, which creates a lot of shadow IT and a lot of shelfware. These are some of the demand side levers that we see. Shikhar, over to you to highlight some of the supply side levers.
Thanks, Udit. So while enterprises can leverage a combination of the demand side levers that we discussed on the previous page, Udit covered those. A lot of value can be extracted by following some best practices around negotiation preparation and some of those critical areas. And in no particular order, if you look at the 5 key points to note here, right? The first point is the fact that successful negotiations require a lot of thinking and preparation. So it is advisable that the team start working on a software contract negotiation strategy at least 6 months prior to the contract renewal date. Information regarding past consumption, future demand estimates, if the enterprise envisages a surge or a peak in demand, should be assessed to negotiate effectively. The next point is around that we want to cover is around negotiation timing. And what we mean by that is often the sales rep of software providers of the SaaS firms are able to get exceptional approvals and discounts towards their fiscal quarter ends or year ends to realize the revenue in that particular quarter or year. And this is an important fact that enterprises need to be aware of, and this could be leveraged by the buyers to get better discounts. Next, the next point is negotiating a price protection clause, especially in the current contract, current economic situation ensures a minimal increase in the software prices at the time of renewals. This saves a lot of time and effort on both sides when the renewal comes up, and there's a clear framework to approach this problem by, right? The next point we wanted to talk about was around price benchmarking. Enterprises can also leverage help from independent advisory firms to ascertain that their rates and discounts are in line. And I think we had a question in the chat around this, right? So, help from independent advisory firms to ascertain that their rates, the discounts are in line with the prevalent market rates for a similar nature of contract. And that's very important. We don't want to look at a contract which comes from a different vertical, a different size, and probably has a different context. So similar nature of contract and the particular SaaS platform is helpful. So having intelligence about similar deals can strongly influence the negotiations in the buyer's favor. Lastly, software providers, provide more discounts on one-time costs as against recurring costs. So, for example, support costs. And enterprises should assess the proposals in detail and try to negotiate more discounts on the recurring costs. And that kind of helps optimize the overall TCO. So those were the few points that we wanted to cover. Achint, any other point that you would like to add?
Sure, Shikhar. I think one of the points that enterprise can prepare for, and one of the most underappreciated fact is that even without taking a benchmarker support or help, right? Often enterprises what they can do to expect what's gonna happen in the future is to go through the publicly stated information such as earning call, the report that come out from the software vendors, right? So for example, doing a thorough analysis, and we have taken an example in the next slide, and here's the case in point that we talk as Salesforce, right? Along with the whole set of information that we came across in the last few months. Now, on the left-hand side, we talk about the different announcement that came out from their leaders, from their CEOs, etc. And on the right-hand side is a possible implication that we are seeing as part of the contract, software vendor contract. You see, Mark, if you talk about Mark, he has talked about, the MuleSoft and Tableau have been one of the most better performing platforms for them. And then they are being part of top 10 deals. Look at the fact also that these two are acquisition-based platforms. Salesforce pretty much played, billions of dollars. Yeah. If you go on to the previous slide, please. Right. So Salesforce pretty much paid billions of dollars for acquiring these platforms, right? So now they are trying to kind of get returns from those. Then if you talk about, they have spoken about the positive growth in terms of industry cloud adoption. This means that Salesforce as an entity may push for more number of industry cloud solutions in the market, right? And this may mean that you can expect more sales conversations happening around those lines, maybe get even better volume discounts or better fee or pricing for those kind of modules. Lastly, there is a clear push on the profitability and the layoff that we have come across for many of the technology firms, right? They do paint a grim picture. So a lot of focus on improving profitability that isn't there in the market right now. And, part of it, what it can mean is that for some of the core platforms, the pricing may increase. There may be a sticker shock that may be coming for some of the enterprises, especially those who have not allowed for those rises for many years now. So that's what our reading of the analyst reports are, and that is some even what the sourcing and vendor management function of the enterprises can interpret from these annual reports. Yeah.
Yep. That is quite an innovative and street smart approach, Achint.
Yeah.
We have talked about being prepared for SaaS contracting related best practices. Udit, any thoughts about what are the best practices to keep the cloud spend in check?
Sure, Rahul. So if we move to on this page, what we have done is we have put together 8 levers that enterprises can explore to optimize the resources that they consume, essentially like the cloud resources that they consume, increase the spend visibility, and how enterprises can leverage different discounting regimes that hyperscalers offer to optimize their overall cloud spend. So the first one is adopting lean provisioning or right sizing. This essentially means, enterprises establishing the process of continuous cleanup to identify zombie assets. And by zombie assets are the assets that have been that have not been used or have been used at a very low scale. So they should be eliminated. The next is consolidating idle resources. This essentially it talks about identifying over provisioned instances through monitoring and performing regular load testing to set the required capacity so that we are not paying for the unused capacity. The third one talks about scheduling infrastructure availability. This essentially says that we should turn off certain instances when they're not being used, especially the dev and test environment. So what we see often is that enterprises take resources in their dev and test environment but forget to turn them off. And unless you turn them off, the bill keeps on coming, right? So that is the next one. Switching to cloud native design, this is nothing but leveraging the auto scaling functionalities that cloud, irrespective of the hyperscaler offer, right? So auto scaling helps to load balance in case there is a surge in demand. They would increase the number of instances. If there is a reduction in demand, then the number of instances would go down, right? So the enterprises should provision for this. Then the next talks about reviewing the cost anomalies. So this essentially means that the cost centers, they should always assess the invoices that they get to identify if there has been a sudden spike in the cost for whatever reasons. And once they are able to identify those spikes, root cause analysis would help them understand the reason behind those spikes and be better prepared for such instances in future. Now, the next two are kind of related, which is leveraging reserved instances or savings plan and spot instances. Now, these are some programmatic discounts being offered by hyperscalers. And as Shikhar previously mentioned, that leveraging these discounts, enterprises could expect a reduction to the tune of 70 to 90%, while is what hyperscalers claim, but that's in a very constrained environment. But in practical, we've seen enterprises save about 40 to 45% by leveraging these discounting regimes. The only caveat around using spot instances is that they can be reclaimed at any point of time by the hyperscaler. So the enterprises need to be very, very cautious about the kind of workload that these spot instances are being used for. Last but not the least is putting the responsibility on each of the user department, which is creating budget for each of the user department and then sitting with them every now and then to review the budgets so that there are no surprises at the end of the quarter or there are no spillovers into the next quarter also. So these are some of the levers that enterprises can use. Some of these can be used immediately to optimize their cloud spend.
Sure. Thanks, Udit. Very valid points. With that, let's move on to the next section in which we will share our prediction for SaaS pricing in the coming year. So before we share our point of view, we would like to hear from everyone in the audience how pricing has changed for them in the recent SaaS contract renewals that they have had. So the options that we have, and you can select one of those options, is increase more than 10, increase between 5 and 10%, increase up to 5%, no change observed, a decrease observed of up to 5%, decrease between 5 to 10%, and lastly, decrease of more than 10%. And let's just give some time for the results to come out. Okay, starting to see some responses come in. Maybe we'll give it 10 seconds more. Okay, 5, 4, 3. Okay. All right. So I think we're done with the poll. Broadly, what we are seeing is that about 46% of the respondents believe that the price has increased between 5 to 10%. And the next top response is basically 29% of the people who are saying that the increase has been more than 10%. Achint, what are your thoughts on the poll results?
So Rahul, I'll start with the fact that I'm not surprised, right, with the figures. Now, decrease was something we were not expecting, and the poll consistently kind of solidifies the fact. The fact that more than almost like 75% or more than 5%, which means that a significant budget breaking that is going to happen for many of the enterprises, right? So again, something that many enterprises are really grappling with is the high inflation and the impact that is taking place on the software licensing contract, right? And there are reasons that we cover for that. Why are those pricing increasing in the next slide? All right. So if we talk about the factors that are resulting in the increase in pricing, right? So it has been an unprecedented year in terms of the software licensing, right? The SaaS licensing and the pricing model that we are seeing. So we do see that with more and more boutique firms entering the software market with the latest product, right? What is happening is that the vendor landscape has become really competitive. Now, with that, the software providers are enhancing their offering. They are bringing in new features, often renaming their old offering with some touch-ups, right? Which effectively doesn't give any sort of comparison with respect to the previous version. Now, with that, in fact, what the vendors, as in the software providers, expect is a higher return for the value of the product for the investment that they did right over the years. The second thing is that there has been a wage inflation, right? Again, the recent market fact is that there are a lot of layoffs happening and all that is happening simultaneously, but the economic inflation is still not going down. Now, with the fact that the wage inflation really shot up for many of these software vendors, they have to pass it on to their consumers, as in the end clients, and that is where the licensing costs have been going up, right? Now, what are the other features is that the vendors, they know that there's a recession that is in the corner, right? Again, are we in the recession or not? That's a debatable question itself. But overall, what we are seeing is that there is a push for the longer term contract because they want continuity from the customers, right? So they are giving longer term contract, pushing for it by offering something more additional. But for the shorter contract, that way the high pricing is continuing, right? So if you're ending up signing a 1-year contract, then a sticker shock may come for you in terms of the pricing. So Shikhar, this being the expectation, what are your thoughts on the pricing trends?
Yeah, thanks, Sachin. So I think this kind of played across the poll as well, right? Where I think almost 70%, as Sachin you mentioned, was around the fact that there's going to be more than 5%, right? And as far as I remember, roughly 20% of the respondents had a view of up to 5% or less than 5%. So what we've done is we've categorized the price increase into two buckets. One where we see price increase vary from 5% to as much as 20%, and one where it is less than 5%. So if you look at the wide range of the first bucket, the bucket on the left, right, this is dependent on the context. So we have seen a lot of legacy contracts which were quite favorable to the buyer, and they're no longer being renewed in the same construct, right? And this often leads to a high increase in the current scenario. Also, we have seen mission critical softwares, right, which, for example, enjoy a dominant market position, or platforms where a major version update is coming with new functionalities, like as I mentioned, and that would fall in this bucket, the bucket on the left. If you look on the bucket which is on the right, which is up to 5%, the second bucket, that would apply to most of the software tools that are important but not necessarily mission critical, right? And this price increase is largely happening, what we understand is due to COLA, right? So you've seen price protection caps being applied during contracting in a lot of these cases, where enterprises protect themselves with from any steep hike. And as Ajit mentioned, typically we would see this in long-term contracts, right? So that's the forecasted trend around pricing. That's what we expect, and that's what we saw play out in the polls as well. With regard to pricing models, Udit, what are the key changes that you believe will transpire?
Right, Shikhar. So, like you said, right? So, while we are witnessing an evolution or change in the prices for software, the pricing model itself is also evolving, right? So now we're seeing a shift from a pure subscription-based licensing model to a value-based or a usage-based model. And I think there was a question around this in the chat as well. So let's try and understand what is actually a usage-based model when it comes to SaaS, right? So it is in just for simplification, right? So this usage-based model for SaaS is just like the model that we have for hyperscalers, wherein the customers would be charged only for the time when they use the software product and not for the entire subscription term, right? Now there are some of the enterprises have already started rolling out this in some shape or form, and hence we're seeing a shift from a pure subscription model to a pure value based or a usage based model. Now there are different categories that we see or different models that we see in the market. The first one is consumption based pricing or pay as you go model. Now there are vendors like MongoDB, Snowflake, etc., who are charging their customers only for the resources that they use. They're not charging them a flat fee for, like, a month of subscription or a year of subscription. They're charging them for the only the capacity that they end up using. The second is impact based pricing. Here the software providers are charging their customers based on the impact that their software product is creating for their customers, right? So some of the examples would be, let's say, LiveRamp, which is a marketing tech company, right? So they charge their customer based on the per thousand ad impressions that their product creates for the customer on a particular website. Another example for this would be Adobe Campaign Manager. This product is charged based on the number of people to whom the ad campaigns or sales campaigns are sent out using Adobe Campaign Manager. So these are some of the examples of impact-based pricing. Now, the third one is volume-based pricing. All of us are aware about it, but this has been more prevalent in the perpetual licensing domain, right? Wherein the per unit cost of a license would go down if we buy more number of licenses. The same is now being offered by SaaS-based products, wherein if we increase the number of subscriptions that we buy, we would get tier discounts, or once we finalize our current usage, the software providers are willing to negotiate tiered pricing in case the usage goes up, right? So these are some of the examples, and there is a shift. And now, but the most prevalent that we see is a hybrid kind of model, wherein there is still a portion of subscription-based pricing, but it is linked to usage or value. Now, what is in it for the software provider and customers? It's a win-win situation for both of them. For customers, this has reduced the cost of entry, right? Since the customers are supposed to pay only for the time that they use a particular software product, they can test new products, see if those products meet their requirement without investing a lot of time or a lot of money into it, right? For software providers, it's a win-win situation because it has resulted in more customer retention, because customers are kind of feel that the pricing is more transparent when it is linked to only the time that they use a product or the impact that a product is making on their business. So net, we are seeing an evolution in the pricing model as well. Over to you, Rahul.
Thanks, Udit. So we are nearing the end of the insights that we wanted to share. Before we open up, the forum for Q&A, wanted to let the audience know that the strategies and trends that we have shared in this webinar, they come from live contract optimization engagements that we have conducted for enterprises. And these cut across, the following slivers. First one is essentially where we do pure price benchmarking, looking at what are the current pricing or rates that enterprises are paying for a particular software or cloud platform, and then comparing it with the best-in-class pricing that we see in other similar contracts, and then identifying what is the optimization potential. The second one is what we call negotiation support. And as part of this, we provide arm's length support for enterprises on what are the most, which are the negotiation levers which have maximum potential for a particular contract that is in a negotiation. With, for example, what are the right license metrics to look at, whether it should have, whether the contract should have a tiered pricing mechanism, some kind of a discounting mechanism, what are the important KPIs and SLAs to include into the contract, minimum commitment, so on and so forth. Lastly, the third type of engagements that we regularly do is basically what we call demand optimization, in which we evaluate the existing state of the consumption from the enterprise's perspective, identify which are or what's the extent of unutilized licenses, assess the future roadmap to optimize the demand for licenses, and as Udit was referring to earlier, do some kind of a persona profiling to identify the optimum mix of software modules to effectively meet the business requirements. And if we go to the next slide, we provide these services for various types of products, ranging from productivity and collaboration platforms such as Microsoft M365, Google Workspace, to industry-specific platforms such as Guidewire and Facets, for example, in the insurance space. These could also be some industry-agnostic products such as CRM and ERP systems. Then it also includes ITSM products such as ServiceNow and BMC Remedy. And lastly, cloud platforms such as Azure, AWS, GCP. And on top of that, the cloud management platforms such as vRealize, CloudBolt, etc. So do feel free to reach out to us if you have an upcoming software or cloud contract purchase, or even a renewal for which you need guidance. And with that, let's take up some of the questions that have come up from the audience. Okay, so one of the questions that came up was, what are the most effective means of combating the year-on-year indexation provisions that software firms expect? Achint, do you want to offer some perspective on that?
Sure, Rahul. Again, on that one, I do believe that price protection clauses are the best way to combat any major inflation, right? Any major changes in the pricing. Again, it do depend that where you are starting from, right? If you're already so low on the pricing, then it may not be that pragmatic unless you have a major spend in play. If you're spending millions and millions of dollars with the product vendor, right? Then you may again negotiate for good protection clauses. But net-net, there are multiple factors that can be involved when negotiating that particular clause.
Okay, thank you, Achint. Okay, Udit, what is your take on this one? What is our view on software cost optimization, and should it be done by third parties? How is software true up? How effective is software true up? And is software asset management, or SAM, really working?
Right. So I think, Rahul, we can't stress enough on the importance of software spend optimization. I think that was the whole idea of this webinar, right? In terms of if leveraging, whether to leverage a third party or do it in-house, we've seen both, right? So we've seen mature organizations who have their own internal software asset management team, which kind of helps the IT team and the procurement team with the consumption data, what are their what is their entitlement in terms of number of licenses against their entitlement, what are they using and what are they not using. We've also seen enterprises that do not have a very mature SAM practice. They leverage third-party software asset management firms like the likes of Flexera, SoftwareOne, etc., who help these clients optimize their overall demand through scientific ways, right? So obviously, I mean, yes, 100% software asset management helps in optimizing when it comes to software licensing true-ups as well.
Okay, thank you, Udit. The next question is, what leverage do I have in negotiations with the big tech players, Microsoft, SAP, Salesforce, etc. Let me take this one. Now, what we feel is, buyers may not always realize, but they frequently do have leverage over the tech vendors, even if they are the biggest tech companies in the world. And the reality is that if there was no leverage, then we would have seen similar pricing charged by, Microsoft, Salesforce, AWC, etc., for various different types of situations. But the reality is that we commonly see variances of anywhere between 15 to 25%, even when the size of the buyer, the overall volumes, the overall spend, they're all in similar ranges. And the reason why this variance exists is that some buyers are able to recognize that they do have leverage and they can effectively capitalize on it during negotiations. Whereas the other buyers may be oblivious to the leverage that they have. Now, some of the points that we have seen buyers use effectively in recent negotiations are, first of all, any kind of adverse event news. For example, if there is a downturn in the industry, or if senior leadership from your organizations or even from your peer organizations have made any public announcements around downsizing or cost cutting, that is one of the triggers to really initiate cost rationalization discussions with your tech vendors. As an example, we can kind of easily state that when COVID was at its peak, one of the industries which was really affected by it was the oil industry. And we saw, many of the oil players being able to get sizable reductions from their SaaS as well as cloud vendors at that point in time. If I talk about another point of leverage, and this is a positive factor, it's not a negative factor. If you're going to buy some new modules or new products that have been released by a particular vendor, more often than not, the vendors would want to incentivize or subsidize the sale that is happening in this new release or this new module. And they would be willing to give discounts for some of the other modules that you are purchasing. So that's another thing to be on the lookout for. And one more that I can kind of bring up, and this is specifically true for small sized purchases, is that if you're dealing with small ticket sizes, a large tech company may not be really interested in giving any kind of a discount or entertaining any such request. But in such cases, it makes sense to go via a large account reseller, because a small purchase which may not be important for a big company could be actually important to a reseller, and who can then apply some leverage on the tech vendor and give the best deal possible to the client. So that's what my response is to that particular question. If you look at the next one, what is the major cause of price hikes in cloud pricing? Shikhar, you want to offer any perspective?
Yeah. And I'm aware of the fact that we're completely out of time, but so I'll just try to make it fairly quick. So we've covered some of the reasons why prices are getting hiked, right? So in one of those slides. But when we talk about specifically cloud providers, there are probably 5 or 6 quick points that I would like to mention. Firstly, we are in a macroeconomic situation where rising interest rates exist, and that impacts the capital lease costs that these hyperscalers have, right? So that's a significant cost pressure that they have. The second is that the increased spending is also driven by the significant spending on ESG parameters that these hyperscalers have to make their data centers carbon efficient. So there's an increased spending there as well. The third point is the fact that there's a significant rise in energy prices for a significant time. That it's a stubborn price increase that has been done, and that feeds into the cost pressures, right? The next point is the fact around supply chain challenges, right? So, for example, the semiconductor shortage that we've seen, and although that has eased out a little bit, that has played into the significant headwind that these hyperscalers have. And lastly, beyond the cost pressures, most cloud providers, the top two at least, are entering a higher stage of maturity, where the era of deep discounts are essentially over. So very quickly, those were the few points which are leading to hikes in particularly cloud in the cloud world.
Sure. Thank you, Shikhar. And then just one final message from us on the next slide, to go through some interesting perspectives that we have to offer on software and cloud contract negotiations. Feel free to go through our blogs. And with that, it's a wrap. Thank you everyone for joining. Have a good day. Have a good evening.